tonight. So like I said, my name is Katerina Hea, and I'm the Repair Network organizer. I'm coming in tonight from Yokut's lands and Mono traditional territories in Central California. And I invite you to share your names, your faith communities, or whatever communities you identify with, as well as the Indigenous territories where you live in the chat. And also with me tonight is Sarah Augustine, our coalition's co-founder and executive director. And Sarah, I would welcome you to just come on and introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Augustine. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I am coming to you from the homeland of the Confederated Bands and Tribes of the Yakima Nation, the Yakima Indian Reservation here in Central Washington. And I myself am not Yakima, but a Tewa woman. So glad to be here with you all.
Thank you, Sarah. I welcome those who are just joining us for the first time. We'll take some time in our second hour to welcome new Repair Network members. I know several of you have just joined us, which is very exciting. The Repair Network, for those of you who are new, is a way for Christian faith communities to join our coalition and organize both locally on the ground and internationally in solidarity with Indigenous communities working towards justice. So we are a pathway to move from educational work towards reparative action. And we're working right now around several active campaigns in relation with different Indigenous groups, which include protecting the Indian Child Welfare Act, which we're going to be hearing more about tonight, and Protect Oak Flat, which we'll hear an update during our second hour. As you all know, ICWA, or the Indian Child Welfare Act, has been challenged in the Supreme Court in the case Brackeen v. Holland. And it's currently being decided about whether or not ICWA is unconstitutional. So during this first hour, I have the honor of welcoming and we'll be hearing from Sarah Kastelic, the executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, or NIWRC, and Shoney Blake, counsel at Pipestem Law PC in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Shoney co-authored the Amicus Brief for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, or the NIWRC, which we organize church communities around to sign onto that Amicus Brief through our coalition. And we've been involved in protecting ICWA in a variety of other ways as well. So I just want to invite Sarah again, if you don't mind, Sarah, coming off mute and maybe sharing a little bit of background about how our coalition first got involved around the Indian Child Welfare Act and any current plans or actions that may be in the works.
Sure. So good to see so many familiar faces. So in 2018, Tristan Tips Webster reached out to me personally and in response to an article I wrote about ICWA and asked if I would be willing to reach out to people of faith and faith communities to organize around upholding ICWA. And that was really when we started our relationship with NIWRC, the National Indian Child Welfare Association. And so in February 2019, we reached out to see about participating in an amicus brief at that time, but the amicus brief deadline had already passed. And at that time, there was only one brief that contained a faith community, and they sided with the plaintiffs. That brief was filed by the Christian Alliance for Indian Welfare. And that was really where we said, gosh, we've got to organize people of faith to get involved in upholding ICWA. And so in July 2022, I reached out to David Simmons. I met him in 2018 also, who from NIWRC, who got us in touch with the National Association, or let's see, Native American Rights Fund, NARF. And they put us in touch with Mary Catherine Nagel from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and we were able to join their amicus brief. And I believe we brought 30 communities of faith into that. I think 30. And so we were really excited to be finally, after many years, able to stand with Indigenous communities in support of NIWRC in a brief. So that's my short summary of how we got to where we are today. And then we continue to work on trying to move the narrative within the church or people of faith, Christians especially, coming to true solidarity with Indigenous peoples in upholding ICWA. And so our working group within the coalition is working on an action right now, calling on the Attorney General in Indiana to meet with our youth delegation and to be accountable for why Indiana has made the suit to strike down ICWA. And so we recognize that right now at the Supreme Court level, we don't have a lot of influence over the Supreme Court, but we do want to move the narrative within the Christian church and really call people on faith, calling on elected officials to say, help us understand why you are opposing ICWA when we people of faith are supporting it and standing in support of Indigenous families and Indigenous children. So that's where we're at today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that background. And I really just want to, again, say thank you so much. It's such an honor to have two such leaders in the movement to protect ICWA with us tonight, Sarah Kastelic and Shoney Blake. Thank you so much for your time, for being willing to speak with this coalition of faith-based groups and help us to imagine forward how we as Christian communities can help challenge that narrative that Christians don't support ICWA and stand in deeper solidarity with you all in your really important work. So I'm going to just take a moment to spotlight you both so that we can see you amidst this whole mosaic of panels of representatives of faith communities. Here is Sarah and Shoney, and I will invite you in your own way to introduce yourselves to us and then to share for each of you, why is protecting ICWA important to you on a personal level, on a political level, on whatever level you wish to share, just a way of introduction, and then sharing why is this so close to your heart, to your work. Thank you.
I'll let Sarah go first. She really is the leader in the space.
I was going to say, thank you, Shoney, and I'll let you go first. You're the reason I ended up here. So we're going to be two kind ladies and keep deferring to each other, I think. Well, I'm happy to go first. Shemai, good evening. Thank you all so much for joining this important conversation. My name is Sarah Kastelic. I'm a citizen of the native village of Uzinki, which is a small Alaska Native village near Kodiak, Alaska. I'm a social worker by training, and growing up, I didn't know anybody who was a social worker. I didn't know that profession, but my dad, my Alutiiq father, always told me that when we need help, if we help other people, that we'll always find the help we need. So I think it was that teaching that ultimately led me to social work. The Indian Child Welfare Act is really important to me. At NIWRC, when we do training about ICWA, we actually go pretty far back in time. We actually say the reason that ICWA is so important is because of the legacy of colonization around the world. And so we say that colonizers were incredibly effective. And that there's actually a universal recipe for colonization. And we call it a recipe because there is a very intentional list of ingredients, and you do things in a certain order to produce a certain outcome. And so when we think about the recipe for colonization, the first ingredient is to take the land. And the second ingredient is to control the natural resources, especially the water. The third ingredient is to usurp Indigenous governance, to supplant Indigenous ways of governing ourselves and our communities with Western forms of government. The fourth ingredient is to delegitimize Indigenous thought. That means to devalue Indigenous values, Indigenous worldview, to make these things seem backwards or savage or silly, but to devalue Indigenous worldviews. And then the fifth ingredient in this recipe, the most important ingredient, is to take the children. And taking the children severs the sense of identity, severs the sense of belonging, prevents children from growing up feeling connected to extended family and community, prevents them from having a sense of who they are and the strong legacy of their ancestors who came before them. It stops that socialization process. And so really, colonization ultimately relies on taking the children. And this has happened the world over. And the Indian Child Welfare Act is one attempt to stop this unnecessary forced removal of our children from our communities, this legacy of family separation that uses Western values imposed on Native communities as a rationale for removing children because of poverty, because of lack of electricity, or because of living in traditional housing with dirt floors, or because of an extended family network that takes care of kids the way we traditionally always have. So misunderstanding those cultural practices and ways and teachings is what allowed for the massive forced removal of our children from our families. And so ICWA is really important to me because it's the tool that helps us stop that process. It's the tool that we have to put up guardrails around state agency behavior and private adoption agencies taking our children and adopting our children out. It's what allows us to give Native kids the best chance of remaining connected to their extended family, to their community, to their culture, and to their sense of who they are. So thank you so much for allowing me to be with you this evening, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'll pass that same question on to Shoney.
Halito, Sahochipoya Shoney Blake. Hello, my name is Shoney Blake. I am a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm a descendant of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. And I live on the Muskogee Creek Reservation here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So ICWA, I'll just connect, I guess, mine a little bit to what Sarah said, and bring up another term that I think is very relevant, has been for a while, which is intergenerational trauma. So ICWA to me is very important for helping to heal a lot of the intergenerational trauma that colonization has caused within our Native communities, having to do with that disconnection and lack of belonging. And colonization had this effect on Indigenous communities in many ways, specifically in the United States in many ways. One was through Indian boarding schools. Another was through the states, which ICWA was there to combat, to the states taking Indian children away from their homes. So we had the federal government doing it, we had the state government doing it, or state governments doing it. But then also part of what this does, and what you hear from a lot of survivors from this time when children were being taken from their homes for various reasons, is that they not only lacked belonging and connectedness, but were then put in institutional situations, or even maybe sometimes in homes where they didn't have, not only did they not have any connection to their people or to their communities, but they also a lot of time didn't have good parental role models. And so especially with the children who were put in foster care, or the children who were put in Indian boarding schools, tell stories about not understanding how to love their own children or parent their own children in ways that were appropriate or that were not appropriate, but that were positive and beneficial, because of they themselves as children didn't get to experience that because they were ripped out of their communities and raised in this way, and oftentimes made to feel ashamed of who they were and where they came from, right? And so that I think, even though in some cases some people are a little farther away from like I'll say my grandmother was in a boarding school, right? So I haven't directly felt some of that, but I can see we can see the legacy of those actions down through the generations, right? Of people relearning not only their connections to their communities, but also even relearning basic parenting techniques, unfortunately, and basic coping mechanisms, right? Because of how the children were then socialized once they were put into these situations. And then they became adults who then had to find some way to parent and teach their own children. And so the effects linger on. And so I see ICWA in that big, greater institutional way of as a stopgap in keeping those things from continuing and keeping that intergenerational trauma from continuing throughout our communities. And I will just say, on a personal note, ICWA is also very important to me because my niece, I don't even know if we would have known about my niece had it been for ICWA, and being alerted, thankfully, by state officials that she even existed. And because of ICWA, my niece, she's my cousin's child, is able to be part of our family and maintain her connection to our family that otherwise would not have been there had this super incredibly important legislation not been in place. And I think the last thing I want to say before we get too far down the road is I want to make sure that people understand the importance of this this legislation to tribal sovereignty. So I feel like a lot of times ICWA is positioned as a racial categorization instead of thinking about the tribes as communities and having their own government and how important it is to maintaining the community and the government, and less about the color of our skin or our physical features or things like that. It's really, really important to understand ICWA as a way to maintain tribal sovereignty, and we're not going for racial purity here. That's like not the goal. The goal is to maintain our sovereign tribal nations.
Thank you for sharing that, Shoney, and especially that last note about tribal sovereignty. And I wondered, Sarah, if you wanted to comment on that at all as well. I'm so glad that you brought that up, since that seems to be a core argument being used in this case. In the Brackeen v. Holland case is almost this reverse racism argument. And so if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more, Sarah, on how tribal sovereignty is at stake and anything else that you want to share along those themes.
Thank you, Katerina. Yes. I mean, the first thing I would say is that the Indian Child Welfare Act fundamentally does three things. It puts in place minimum standards for state removal of Native kids. So states can't remove Native children the way that they once did, this wholesale removal, but actually in order for states to remove Native children, they have to actually have evidence that children are at risk of harm. So it's not just about cross-cultural misunderstandings or imposing a different set of standards, but there actually needs to be evidence that there's imminent threat of harm to children. So those minimum standards is one of the purposes of ICWA. But the next purpose of ICWA, the second purpose, is a recognition of tribal sovereignty. It's a recognition that tribes as nations have an interest in their citizens, especially their most vulnerable citizens, children, and that tribes actually have key information, important resources that are necessary in order to make decisions about what's in the best interest of Native children. So knowing the families, understanding the culture, being aware of possible placement preferences with extended family, thinking about the ability to offer culturally based services for healing. All of these things are very important and critical to child custody cases, critical to the well-being of Native children. And tribal nations themselves are the ones who are best positioned to marshal that information, to be involved in making decisions about what's in the best interest of their children. So tribal sovereignty features significantly in this legislation. And then the third point, just quickly, the third purpose of ICWA is actually to provide some resources, and at the time, pretty meager resources, and still today, pretty meager resources to allow tribes to develop their own services for children and families to serve their own citizens instead of relying on state systems and services. We know that state systems and services don't serve Native families and children well. They never have. And I would argue that state systems actually don't serve most children and families well. They're not really a good fit for anybody, and that the systems are actually set up in a way that creates trauma and passes trauma down generation to generation, which is part of the reason that this law is so important, and that tribes having a say in making decisions for their citizen children, for the families that they serve, is so important. Because tribal systems very frequently contrast 180 degrees with state or county systems. Frequently, tribal systems, especially when they're re-indigenized, are set up intentionally to do things that state systems don't, and in many cases can't. So the ability to intervene much earlier. So we think of this as like being neighborly, being aware of what's going on with the families in your community. When you see somebody struggling, reaching out in a friendly way to say, seems like something's going on. Maybe something feels really hard right here. Do you need some help? Is there something I can do? But the state system is set up to wait for bruises. It's set up to wait for abandonment. It's set up to wait until there's real harm to families instead of intervening much earlier to try to prevent that harm. So tribal nations and the systems that they set up to meet the needs of kids and families are from a different orientation, a different philosophy. Tribal systems are intentionally intervening in ways that stop the transmission of trauma and that provide community supports, that provide tribal child welfare services as a way to actually help families heal. So tribal sovereignty is critical to thinking about ICWA, and in turn, the effective implementation of ICWA, making sure that Native kids have the opportunity to be safely at home with their families and communities whenever possible. In turn, those provisions reinforce tribal sovereignty. It's a way of ensuring that tribal nations will continue to exist in perpetuity as their citizens are protected, as their citizens grow up safe and healthy, connected to their community, knowing who they are, ready to be of service to their community. So tribal sovereignty is really at the heart of why ICWA was passed in the first place, and ensuring that ICWA continues to be implemented in turn undergirds tribal sovereignty.
Thank you for that. Really just bringing home that importance of tribal sovereignty and these protections that ICWA provides. I'll just pause and say right now that if others have questions, I'll be kind of moderating a Q&A time during our last 10 or 15 minutes. So you're welcome to put your questions in the chat, and we'll go through and gather and harvest some of those questions for the end. And I just have a few more questions for you all that Sarah Augustine and I have brainstormed together. One of them is just, right now the Supreme Court is deciding whether or not it will be upheld. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about what are the repercussions you've already been getting at this in your first responses, but what are some of the other repercussions if ICWA is not upheld? And along with that, how might we be preparing, or how are you already preparing for different outcomes?
Well, I'll kind of jump in with the catastrophic scenario, and then let Sarah talk more about like on the ground preparations that are closer to like ICWA in general. But I think the biggest worry with Brackeen, which is the case that that the Supreme Court is considering right now about ICWA, is that well, there are indications that the court took this case as part of a kind of a general movement by the court to get rid of affirmative action kind of based statute or based legislation and ideas. So it was taken, for example, in the same term that they reconsidered the rulings that allow colleges to consider race in their admissions processes, right? So and there were a few other cases sort of like that. So the concern, one of the big concerns, is that the court isn't seeing the court is seeing this as another opportunity to strike down race-based classifications that are actually beneficial in some ways. And that is one of the reasons why I pointed out that this really is a political classification and not a race-based classification. So a lot of the fear is, right, that all of our treaties, which are based on government-to-government relationships between tribal nations in the United States, will now, under whatever reasoning they come up with, could potentially become all of those treaty rights could be at issue if the court decides that this here in ICWA is a race-based classification. So that could have really, really devastating consequences in all of Indian law, right? Because ICWA is constitutional for the same reasons that a lot of our treaty rights are constitutional. They are based off of a trust relationship between tribal nations and the government that arose out of our relationship, our treaty relationships. So that is kind of, hopefully, you know, the oral arguments went really well, I think, and great questions were asked. So hopefully that is not the way the court goes, but that is the potential is there. And then I'll let Sarah talk about the stuff closer to home with ICWA.
Thanks, Shoney. Well, I guess maybe the first thing I want to say is to really underscore Shoney's point that ICWA has nothing to do with race, that ICWA is based on a political status. It's based on the political relationship between a tribal nation and their citizen. And so the reason that we know that ICWA is grounded in this relationship is because we look at where ICWA applies. So the protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act don't apply to every Native person. They don't apply to everyone who self-identifies as American Indian or Alaska Native. They don't apply to people who are not a member of a federally recognized tribe. So there's a very narrow subset of Native people to whom the protections of ICWA apply. And that group of people is children who are members of a tribe, or children who are eligible for membership if they have a biological parent who's a member. So if you just think about the application of the law, that's squarely about citizenship. That has absolutely nothing to do with race. So I think that's a really important point that Shoney lifted up, and I just wanted to reiterate that. I guess the other thing I would say about what's at stake in this case is that it's important to recognize that there are a number of different outcomes, a number of different scenarios. So there were 4 parties in this case, and together, the parties raised 4 separate claims for why ICWA is unconstitutional, 4 separate constitutional challenges. And so there is an incredibly wide range of potential decisions the Supreme Court could arrive at. So Shoney described one, which is kind of like worst case scenario, which is the court buys into this phony race-based argument and they declare ICWA unconstitutional, and in so doing, jeopardize more than 200 years of federal Indian law and all of the precedent that has been set based on that nation-to-nation relationship. So that's absolutely worst case scenario. I should also mention in that scenario, the protections of ICWA go away. So the thousands of children and families who are now protected by these provisions of law are now subject to the same mainstream child welfare system that does so much damage to many kids and families throughout the country. So that really is kind of the worst case scenario in this case. So we could back way up and talk about the other extreme. The other extreme is that the Supreme Court could affirm the constitutionality of ICWA in all 4 of those claims. So they could throw out all 4 of those bogus arguments and say, we don't buy any of this, and we affirm and uphold ICWA. And then in between those 2 extremes, there are a number of possible different decisions based on those 4 different claims about why ICWA is unconstitutional. I think I'll just maybe raise 1 or 2 here to give an example. So one of the claims that the opponents raised was that ICWA commandeers states for federal purposes. So the idea is basically that through passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, Congress exceeded their authority and required states who generally have the ability to regulate around issues of child and family matters. Generally, it's the responsibility of states to regulate domestic affairs. But ICWA exceeds Congress's authority and actually requires states to use some of their resources, state child welfare agencies, to use their own resources to provide these extra services and protections to Native kids. So that's the commandeering argument, that actually Congress didn't have the authority to do that, and actually it should be left up to states to decide whether anything like the protections of ICWA should exist or not. So if the Supreme Court should buy that argument, if they should agree that in some way ICWA commandeers states, then a variety of things could happen. So most likely what they would do is point to some of the particular provisions in the law, a few of the protections, and say these specific things exceed the authority of Congress. They commandeer states, they require states to do things that states shouldn't be required to do. And so not to get too much into the weeds, but some of those things that some of the judges in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found challenges with were things like requiring state child welfare agencies to provide what's called active efforts to keep families together, or if a child has to be removed, then the goal of that case plan is to reunify the child with their family if that can be done safely. So that focus that's on family integrity and keeping families together is really important to ICWA. And yet one of the arguments the opposition makes is that requiring states to provide those active efforts to do that is commandeering them. So if the Supreme Court would find that that's true, then they could take away that requirement. They could strike down that provision of ICWA and basically not require states to provide those elevated protections, provide those active efforts to try to keep families together. So in that case, the impact would be, although some of the protections of ICWA survive, that tribes will still get notice when one of their members is involved in a child custody proceeding, that there is still the ability for tribes to intervene in cases or to transfer cases to tribal court. So we might imagine that some of those things survive, but something like active efforts may be something that the court strikes down. And so that means we have a law that still has some provisions that provide some protections, but it's not nearly as robust as it currently is. It doesn't provide nearly as many protections. And so we could imagine that if states don't have to provide as many services and supports to Native families, if they don't have to proactively engage them and do everything they can to keep that family together, that at least some states, and maybe most or all states, won't do it if it's not required, because it's expensive to work with families in this way. We know it produces better outcomes, but we also know it's expensive, and we know state child welfare agencies have lots of trouble filling vacancies, and we know that state workers, like many tribal workers, have very high caseloads. And so if there's not that federal protection in place, if it's not required that states have to go above and beyond for Native families to try to make up for some of that terrible history of forced removal of Native kids, then chances are states aren't going to do that. And more kids will go into the state foster care system, and fewer Native families will be able to stay together. So the specifics of what happens in this case and what the implications are really pretty different depending on where the court lands in their decision.
Thank you for sharing those different aspects of and considerations of what could happen in these different scenarios. And Shoney, I'm wondering, do you have anything to add, or shall I move to the next question?
I think the only other thing that I would add is that for anybody, if you're interested in any of the other cases that this Supreme Court has taken on, there's another kind of common thread in here where the issue of standing is important. So whether these families that brought the case have actually even suffered an injury. And so I know, so the court could also dispose of it on those grounds. But what's the, I guess flimsy standing arguments have sort of cropped up in a lot of places also with this court. And so that's something to think about. And I'll point out to you that at least two of the families that brought this suit were able to adopt their children, the children at issue, and actually have the adoptions were completed before they went before the Supreme Court. So that's part of the struggle with the standing issue. I think one of the other children went to live with his grandma. So that's something to think about too when we're looking at this case. Is it's one that pulls on people's heartstrings, because they're like, oh, these poor adoptive families who have put so much effort into these children, when these particular adoptive families, for the most part, got the children that they were trying to get. So the process worked. And it's just more evidence that this process that is not race-based, where the inquiry is to try to do what's best for the child and to use these efforts is not outcome determinative, right? That it's a process that will work, and that it doesn't preclude non-Native families from adopting Native children.
Thank you. I think that's really important. And an aspect of this narrative that we're hoping to organize around, we've really seen the ways that these families who happen to be Christian families are using this narrative of Christianity and adoption and some theology around, what adoption means in Christian scripture and so on to drive this case forward and to kind of shift the narrative. And one of our hopes is to kind of take back that story and to show that there are Christians here, that we are as a coalition. We represent at least 20 or 30 different Christian faith communities on this call tonight. And I'm wondering, do you have any recommendations or suggestions to us about ways in the meantime, while we wait on this outcome, where we can spread a different message in support of ICWA, or perhaps actions? I saw a question in the chat about really kind of getting at, what can we do now? We can't really lobby the Supreme Court, but what are some ways that we as a Christian coalition might come alongside and lend our power and voice?
It's a great question. And first, I want to thank you for signing on to the brief that Shoney wrote. So I think becoming a signatory on an amicus brief for a case before the Supreme Court definitely enables us to tell a different story. I talk to folks from the media every week, and this issue of the white savior complex, rescuing Native children from their communities, from their families, comes up all the time. And it's really powerful to be able to say, look at these faith communities who signed on to this brief. Let's not paint the story with one brush. Let's insert some complexity here. Let's talk about nuance. Let's talk about the differences within groups instead of putting everybody together in one bucket. So I do think that the work that you've already done is powerful. And when I talk to the media, it gives me an important talking point to be able to say, actually, there's more to this story. Let's not treat everybody the same. Let's not look at people of faith in one perspective. So I commend you for what you've already done. Let me say that first. The other thing I would say is that our organization, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, works closely with 3 other national Native organizations. So they are the National Congress of American Indians, the Native American Rights Fund that Sarah mentioned earlier, and the Association on American Indian Affairs. And together, our 4 national Native organizations have been working since 2018 under the umbrella of the Protect ICWA campaign. So we've been working together on a strategy that we think about as a 3-legged stool. So on the one hand, we're looking at the wave of litigation. So we're talking today primarily about one case, Holland v. Brackeen, that's before the Supreme Court. But before this case got to the Supreme Court, there were more than a dozen cases that were filed related to the Indian Child Welfare Act, some of them alleging ICWA not being constitutional. Not all of them were about that, but there were several other challenges. And so, so I think because of this wave of litigation, our organizations got together, got organized, and have really looked more at litigation, how to be involved in litigation, have supported amicus brief filings around multiple cases. And so we've really paid attention to litigation and in trying to support attorneys who are representing tribes in cases, who are representing Native families in cases, who are representing Native kids in cases, to make compelling arguments to the court. So, so that leg of the stool that's about litigation is one important task. The second leg of the stool is about policy. And so we think about tribal policy, about keeping kids safe, about working with states around implementation of the Indian Child Welfare Act. We think about state policy. We think about state ICWA laws, state agreements with tribes, state training and infrastructure institutions that help them do a better job with implementing ICWA. So there's a whole variety of legislation that's possible, policy work. Some of that can be administrative policy, either the federal administration, state administration. So there's really a lot of different ways to look at policy. But policy can definitely be used to bolster the Indian Child Welfare Act, particularly as we were talking about earlier in that claim about commandeering. If the US Supreme Court should decide that ICWA commandeers states, that it requires states to do things that states shouldn't have to do, guess what? If states pass their own ICWA laws, if they bind themselves to those protections, then a commandeering finding wouldn't matter at all. Even if the Supreme Court found that ICWA unlawfully commandeers states, if states have already decided to implement all of those protections themselves, then it doesn't matter what the Supreme Court decides. So in that vein. So I think that policy leg of the stool is a really important one. And then the third leg of our stool is very similar to some of the things that you all were already talking about changing the narrative. So the third leg of our stool is about communications work. The last time the Supreme Court heard an ICWA case was the adoptive couple v. baby girl case. And in that case, Indian country was terribly misrepresented in the media, and there was an absolute lack of voice and perspective of Native people, of tribes. The adoptive family in that case really sucked up all the media attention, and the media covered this case from one perspective. And so we learned a really painful lesson in that case. And as this case started making its way, even at the much earlier stages, we recognized that we have to have a big component of our campaign that's about communications. And that's about working with white allies, working with people of color, working with journalists, working with policymakers to learn more about the Indian Child Welfare Act, to learn why it's important. And contrary to what the opposition says, to understand why it's needed so urgently today, why the Indian Child Welfare Act isn't a thing of the past, something that might have been nice a couple decades ago when it was passed, but is actually just as urgently needed today, given the disproportionate representation of Native kids in state foster care systems. So that work around communications has been really important. We have a Protect ICWA campaign petition that more than 70,000 people have signed on to. We have social media on Twitter and Instagram. So we have robust campaigns there. We have long lists of allies. We've done virtual convenings with allies and helped to educate broader networks. We've trained spokespeople, including spokespeople with lived experience who are willing to talk to the media about their experience. We have talking points for tribal leaders. We really try to engage with the media. We try to encourage as many interviews, as many stories as possible. We're constantly pitching to the media, especially the longer form stories where you really have more space to talk about some of the complexities and nuances of these issues. So the communications piece of work is really critical for us too. So those are a couple of things that I would just say about what we're doing now and how others can join with us to help protect the Indian Child Welfare Act.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's so comprehensive. And I hope that maybe in the future we could use part of this recording to share out and to share some of this with our, coalition and beyond for our own educational work. I just put that Protect ICWA campaign link in the chat. If folks want to sign that petition, you can find it on that link and share that. And Shoney also shared in advance with me a list of states where you can look up to see, does your state have comprehensive ICWA legislation in place or in process? So Shoney, I'll turn it over to you to respond and share more as you'd like.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I just wanted to add to what Sarah was saying is that, a lot of, I'm looking and I see a lot of you are living on tribal land, maybe. So one of the things you can also do even within your local church communities is that the tribes are always looking for Indian homes in which to place foster children. There's just a shortage. And part of it is there aren't very many Native homes because Native people are a very small part of the population. And unfortunately, a large part of the foster care population, there's like kind of a disconnect there. But then also just seeing my sister's own experience, it is really, really difficult work. It is really difficult work to foster and to be, ICWA compliant, and some of the struggles you have to go through, especially if you have your own children, are pretty difficult. And so even stuff as easy, not as easy, but simply, if you know Indigenous families who are interested in foster care or know some who are doing it already, just do what you can, even just on a personal level or a church community level, to help them and help support them and help them, do the work of fostering children to be able, hopefully, to be with their own families and reconnect with them someday. That I think that too, it doesn't have to be a big national campaign necessarily, but if you're working to help these families increase the belonging and connectedness with the children that they're helping to raise, I think that's also very important work.
Thank you, Shoney. That really brings us into our Q&A time. I saw a question that I believe was just to me, but I'll put it in the chat, from Carol Rose, asking if you have any suggestions for how to find and support, or for example, returning restitution, neighboring tribal structures that implement ICWA and or that support families in the way that you described.
So is this about trying to find some of the tribal communities that implement a model like what I was explaining earlier? Is that the gist of the question?
I'll let Carol clarify from her context as a pastor of a church. Carol, if you wanted to add any more to your question.
So our congregation returns a small, comparatively small restitution every year, and we try to be local, and it's been difficult to figure out how to support, for instance, the Tohono O'odham Nation or the Yaqui Nation, who are our immediate neighbors, in the struggle to like make ICWA work for them. Yeah, and if there are structures, like there are entire settler structures for supporting foster care, but it's been harder to find that you can donate to, but it's been harder to find the tribal ones for us so far.
Okay.
We might be looking in the wrong places.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I don't see you on my screen anymore, so maybe I jumped in prematurely. I'm sorry about that. Okay.
No, that was all I had.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I would say, in my experience, tribal child welfare departments have been pretty open to community collaboration, including partners from neighboring lands. So folks who are off the reservation or on the reservation who have an interest in supporting kids and families, and in particular, the well-being of kids and kids staying connected to their families, I think have done some really good work together. So there are some communities here in the Pacific Northwest where I am. So I'm thinking of a couple of the communities who have really re-indigenized their child welfare systems in the way I was describing. So we worked with the Suquamish tribe in Washington State, for example. The Warm Springs tribe in Oregon has really done some good work. In Sitka, Alaska, they have some really amazing partnerships with the community, where the community is funding or supporting activities that are prevention activities, in the sense that they're about creating space for families to be together and to do fun family things. So whether that's renting out the community swimming pool for one night for Native kids and their families to be able to have a fun activity there. Sometimes it's about providing opportunities for crafting. One summer they bought running shoes and helped families start a running program together. Running is really traditional, and so part of the families were just really interested in starting a running program. So I think there are different ways that communities can reach out, maybe to tribal child welfare programs in particular, to just say, we're aware of the negative history of child removal, and we really want to support tribal programs in caring for Native kids and families, because we believe you can do the best job. They're your citizens. So how can we support that? How can we partner with you in volunteering or community events or helping to fund something?
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. We probably have time for just one more question. I saw one from Roy, which I think you may have already shared some responses to this, but if you have others, the question was, is there anything that we can do to influence the process and outcome at the Supreme Court? Does pressure from the public really matter? Or another take, what effective measures can we take to influence?
Well, so I guess I'll take the first part. I think, unfortunately, for the Supreme Court, there's not much that we can do at this point to influence their decision. So the case went to them back in, oh my gosh, was that November? So they've been considering it now for months and months. And I think we're expecting an opinion probably in June. Is kind of, I think, the guess. It could be longer, but so right now I'm sure they're well on their way to writing and drafting, and in the middle of have probably solidified their opinions on that so far. I think I do want to point out, co-sign to what Sarah said earlier about the communications aspect of things. So it is actually really, really important to hear the side of the tribal people and the children's families, because the adoptive parents do many times tend to get a lot more media attention and a lot more airtime for the reasons that I had kind of said before, which is that it can be a very compelling story, right? But I think at this point, the Supreme Court's probably well on their way to having finished or solidified their opinion. So I don't think that there's a lot to do, at least for this case, in that area.
I agree with Shoney, and I would say that we do believe the court of public opinion matters, and that even if we can't influence the US Supreme Court, that continuing to educate people and influence the court of public opinion matters. And would also just say is something that Shoney probably knows more about than I do, which is, although for a long time, I think people felt that the Supreme Court is immune to what's happening in the media, that in oral arguments, I think it was around the Castro Huerta case, that two different justices actually raised questions that were about two different publications, one an op-ed from the New York Times, and in another case, an article in the Atlantic, and two different justices talked about these stories and raised questions particularly about them to the attorneys there. So to me, that means the media is really important, especially long form media, especially top tier publications. And the justices do read those things, or their clerks read those things and bring them to their attention. And so, so that media work really matters, and continuing to work on changing the narrative as you've described is also really powerful.
I also want to add real quick, signing on to amicus briefs is also important. In Castro Huerta, the NIWRC also submitted an amicus brief in that case. And although we didn't get the outcome that we had advocated for, it was clear that at least Justice Gorsuch had read our amicus brief because he cited it in his dissent. So that is still important work. Signing on to amicus brief still is also important work, especially I feel like here in Indian law, where a lot of the justices honestly are not super well versed.
Thank you for that, and that appeal to the court of public opinion, and that matters. I'm actually going to ask Sarah, who's been commenting in the chat, to maybe come on screen and to share perhaps how people can get involved in our coalition's working group, which has been doing Sunday school classes about ICWA and film screenings and organizing in home congregations and beyond. Would you be willing to just share a little bit, Sarah, about maybe how folks can get involved and help challenge this narrative, like the one that you mentioned in that Mother Jones article?
Sure, you bet. The first thing is, if you're interested in joining our working group, we need you. We want you. We've been running campaign to uphold ICWA now since 2018, and so that is ongoing work. And we welcome your presence on our working group. And We have created materials for you within your own congregation or faith community, including we have multiple sets of talking points. We have the easy talking points, and we have the hard talking points that respond to a Newsweek article written by the opposition attorneys. And we take you through that Newsweek article if you're getting tough pushback. We have a variety of materials, but we are still writing letters to the editor. We're still writing op-eds across the country. We're still holding vigils and reaching out to press contacts and trying to get press to recognize those vigils, that we are people of faith standing with ICWA for the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. And so all of those things are actions we can do, including, we're working in the state of Indiana, where we have quite a lot of constituents, working to get the Attorney General to meet with our youth delegation, and because he's accountable to the people of Indiana for why Indiana joined this case. And so we are working on getting congregations around the state of Indiana to write to the Attorney General's office and ask for this meeting. But whether we have a meeting or no meeting, we are going to have a press conference to launch, and a press conference in front of the Attorney General's office, just to try and keep this issue in the spotlight in the state of Indiana. Many people in Indiana have not even thought about it, but we demand that they think about it and that they care about it, and that they acknowledge people of faith and our youth especially, who are standing with Indigenous peoples to uphold ICWA. So that's kind of more of an ambitious campaign. Would love to have one in Texas and Louisiana. Anybody from Texas or Louisiana, or if you have contacts there, we'd love to do a similar thing. Letters to the editor are fabulous. In fact, Katerina hosted, I think, a Faith Action Hour, just working on how to write a letter to the editor recently. It's something we love to support and just keep this going. We do have people of faith across the country willing to continue to talk about this and work on it and pray about it Sunday by Sunday. And so we need you, we want you, please join us.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and Sarah Kastelic and Shoney Blake. Thank you. Let's just go ahead and give a round of applause or celebrations or clapping hands in your Zoom window for these amazing speakers. I just want to say thank you so much for your time, for your work, for your energy, and we want to stand with you and continue growing in this relationship and in this work, this important work to protect the Indian Child Welfare Act. So thank you so much. And we're going to transition to our second hour. But again, we send you thanks as you leave this part of the Zoom meeting, Sarah and Shoney, and we look forward to being in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Koyana.
Yakoki.
Much gratitude. Thank you. As a way of transition here, there's just been so much content and deep, rich information coming at us. I want to just give us a breather, a little moment to center and move into our bodies, our hearts, our spirits to engage with this work. And so I would like to invite a new partner of the coalition, Paul Vasile, representing Music That Makes Community, to bring some songs into this space, to fill this with some cultural work, some music. We've been collaborating together on a playlist of songs for decolonization work that can be played at vigils or protests or led during worship or in faith communities. And so Paul, who's the director of Music That Makes Community, offered to join us and to lead us in one or two songs for 5 minutes or so. So Paul, if you'd be open to just introducing yourself and your organization, and maybe just share a little bit about the songs that you brought for us to learn tonight.
Hi, friends. Hi, my name is Paul Vasile. I'm in Washington, D.C., which I understand to be historic hunting gathering grounds of the Piscataway, and a space where I come today to share songs out of a practice of, we call it paperless or oral tradition learning and teaching, a way of being in community and how shall I say this, becoming in community, that the ways we sing together, the ways that we make music matter for who we are becoming and how we are in community. And so I hope you'll join me. I'm going to invite us to connect to our bodies, and maybe you just want to find your heart space and maybe just find something like a heartbeat on your body. I'm going to share two songs. The first is by Michael Stillwater, and I'm going to sing it through, and I invite you to line it out with me, but then I'm going to put the words in the chat. We're not singing in the same room. Stay on mute. But friends, invite you as I keep a drone in the room. One by one, everyone comes to remember we're healing the world, one heart at a time. Listen again. One by one, everyone comes to remember. Try it. One by one, everyone comes to remember. We're healing the world. Try that much. We're healing the world, one heart at a time. One heart at a time. That little bluesy note is right. So if it sounds sort of strange to your ear, you're on the right track. Listen one more time. One by one, everyone comes to remember we're healing the world, one heart at a time. Sing with me. One by one, everyone comes to remember we're healing the world, one heart at a time. Once more, one by one, everyone comes to remember we're healing the world, one heart at a time. Might just be a moment, friends, just to sit with this simple drone and just let your body take a breath and release on a note or somewhere, and feel your breath expand deep down into your belly. One conversation at a time, one Zoom call at a time, one letter at a time, maybe one song at a time too. Can we try that? We're healing the world one song at a time. I believe that's possible. One by one, everyone comes to remember we're healing the world, one song at a time. One last time. One by one, everyone comes to remember we're healing the world, one heart at a time. And friends, the work continues. It's never finished. I'm gonna offer one more song. This is by Ali Blakely. It's a new songwriter, song catcher that I've learned. And Ali's doing a lot of work around grief. She's doing a lot of work around showing up with our generational trauma and what it looks like for us to name that, to begin the hard and the painful work of healing that trauma, and also of naming the ways that shame stops us from doing the work that needs to be done. And so this is actually called the Shame Song. It may feel a little bold what we're going to sing, but I want you to notice how your body responds. It's a simple call and an echo, and you can just dive right in. Maybe listen once first. If I'm gonna fall and I'm gonna change, may it serve the whole. May it turn a page. The music's similar for the next part. If I'm gonna fail, and we're gonna fail, I promise. If I'm gonna learn, may it serve the whole. May it serve the future ones. I too deserve belonging. I too deserve to heal. I too deserve aliveness. I deserve to court the shadows here. I too deserve belonging. I too deserve to heal. I too deserve aliveness. I deserve to court the shadows here. Friends, this song invites, whether you're catching that melody really quickly or feeling like, hey, Paul, what are you doing? How are we going to do this? Your body wants to find its way. And if you feel like you can keep a clap, a tap, let your body's vibrations help you learn as well. Friends, one more time, you can quickly echo, if I'm gonna fall, your turn. If I'm gonna fall, and if I'm gonna change, your turn. And if I'm gonna change, may it serve the whole. May it serve the whole. May it turn a page. May it turn a page. If I'm gonna fail, if I'm gonna fail, if I'm gonna learn, if I'm gonna learn, may it serve the whole. May it serve the whole. May it serve the future ones. This one's different. May it serve the future ones. I too deserve belong. I too deserve belong. I too deserve to heal. I too deserve to heal. I too deserve aliveness. I deserve to court the shadows here. I too deserve belonging. I too deserve to heal. I too deserve aliveness. I deserve to court the shadows here. Wonder what might change if we sing it one more time and we make that to a we. Not just an I, but a we. If we're going to fail and going to change, may it serve the whole. Friends, the work we're called to do is not easy work, but it's shadow work even, courting those shadows in our own work, in our own communities, and coming into that space of truth-telling and honesty. Friends, let's sing it one last time. If we're going to fail, if we're going to fail, you can echo or sing with me. And if we're going to change, and if we're going to change, may it serve the whole, may it serve the whole, may it turn a page, may it turn a page. If we're gonna fail, if we're gonna fail, if we're gonna learn, if we're gonna learn, may it serve the whole, may it serve the whole, may it serve the future ones, may it serve the future ones. Sing with me. I too deserve belonging, belonging. We too deserve to heal. We too deserve aliveness. We deserve to court the shadows here. We too deserve belonging. We too deserve to heal. We too deserve aliveness. We deserve to court the shadows here. Friends, I just wonder, take a quick moment and check in with your body. Are you feeling anything? What are you noticing in your body? Just as a moment of connecting to song, even to the faces of others on the screen, maybe even in the chat. What are you noticing? Anything bubbling up for you that connects to your body and this body that we're in virtually?
I hear my heartbeat.
Calmer and more grounded. Thank you. Feeling vibrancy, aliveness. I wonder what our aliveness, our belonging, our healing serve. Our learning, our failing, our changing. Resounding in your body. Thank you. Music matters. Frank, thank you so much for this opportunity. Katerina, thank you, friends, for singing, and thank you for space to let this kind of metabolize and seeing what singing offers by way of this important work that you're doing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paul. That just, yes, allowed for a deeper sense of resonance, for processing what was shared during the first hour for me. And I just feel so excited for future partnerships and bringing more community singing into these spaces, especially by Zoom, as we figure out in an ongoing way how to organize across distance during and after the pandemic. So I'm seeing feeling joy and strength. So much echoed there. Thank you, Paul. And the spirit must have been moving, because later on during our Zoom time together, that second song that you shared around, if we're going to fail and learn, may it serve the whole, that will echo in some of the questions that we bring to small groups. So I love that's where you were led tonight, Paul, and that's where I was feeling led with some questions that we're bringing. So I just want to take a moment and transition as we give our gratitude and thanks to Paul, to transition also to a time of sharing gratitudes with these new members, and welcome to these new members of the Repair Network. Portland Mennonite Church, who sent in this great picture of their vigil around Save Oak Flat. Welcome to Columbus Mennonite Church, and welcome to representatives from the Episcopal Diocese of Eastern Oregon. As I understand, members of their Truth and Conciliation team are on this call. So if any of you, I'll start with Portland Mennonite, are in the Zoom circle tonight, I think Sylvia Shirk might be here. If you just want to come off mute and introduce yourself, and then I'll invite Columbus Mennonite to introduce themselves.
Good evening. I'm Sylvia Shirk from Portland Mennonite Church, coming to you from the land of the Multnomah and many other people groups in the Northwest, in what's now known as Portland, Oregon. Thank you to everyone who's inspired us and helped us on this journey. And it's great to see old friends and people that I'm looking forward to learn to know better in the process of doing this work together. Thank you so much, Katerina and Sarah and Michaela and everyone who's been helping us along. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Welcome. So glad you all voted and decided to join us. And Columbus Mennonite Church, I'm wondering if Carolyn May or anyone else from Columbus Mennonite is here on the call.
I think it's just me tonight. I'm Carolyn May. And I'm really glad to be with you all. We've had a small group of us trying to do some reparative work here locally, and just really excited to connect with you all, learn from you all, and thanks for having us.
Thank you for joining us. Your pastor, Joel Miller, I believe, was on one of our first calls about putting restitution in church budgets. And so I'm so glad that you all have officially joined and know that you've already influenced and been part of the conversation for a while. And Sarah, Augustine, I'm wondering, would you be willing to introduce some of the members that you've met in Eastern Oregon on your recent speaking tour there?
Sure, I would just invite folks from the Diocese of East Oregon. I know I've seen a few of you on this call, if you'd be willing to introduce yourselves. So very glad that you're with us.
I'm Barbara Mayo, and I am in Sisters, Oregon. We have a very large diocese. We cover a lot of territory. I reside on the lands of the Warm Springs, Paiute, Wasco, and Klamath. And happy to be here.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for being here. Anyone else who'd like to come off mute and share from the Diocese of Eastern Oregon?
I saw Roy. Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
My name is Charlotte Wells, and I am in Pendleton on the ancestral land of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla tribes. We actually are within a mile of the reservation borders, and we're just glad to be part of this.
So good to see you, Charlotte. So glad you're here.
So glad. Thank you. Anyone else who would like to share?
I'm Beth Spell, and I live in John Day, Oregon, and I'm a member of the Diocese of Eastern Oregon. I live on the traditional fishing and hunting grounds of the Warm Springs Confederated Tribes, as well as the Umatilla Confederated Tribes, and also possibly the Paiute tribe from Burns. It's kind of a transitional high desert area where people didn't live year round, but they hunted and fished in the summer.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you all for joining us. I'm really celebrating actually, because I think this is the first official non-Mennonite group that has joined our coalition. And that was a goal of ours this year, was to transition from our starting out, our base community, our grassroots community. We started in the Mennonite church and Anabaptist movement, but we wanted to grow to be an ecumenical coalition and open ourselves up to anyone who wants to join us in solidarity work with Indigenous communities working for justice. So you all, as the Episcopal Diocese, are the first ecumenical group to join. So let's just give a round of applause to that. I'm so excited. Woo, I see a lot of clapping hands and fingers waving. This is so rich because we get to bring all of our theological gifts and strengths and charisms to this movement. This isn't just going to be a Mennonite church movement to dismantle the doctrine of discovery. This emerged out of the Christian church, not just Catholics, but Christian church in the 15th century and beyond, and it continues today. And we believe it is the responsibility of those of us who claim to follow Jesus to undo this legal structure, this philosophical structure that was put in the name of Christ, to undo that in the name of Christ. So thank you all for joining us and participating in what will, I believe, become a broad ecumenical movement and is becoming. I see, Ralph, that you have your hand up. Apologies if I missed you in my introductions.
Oh, I just put it up now. I'm Ralph Henn. I'm in Minneapolis. And I consider myself representing myself, but I am a member of the Minneapolis Friends or Quaker meeting.
Wonderful. More ecumenical friends and partners in the group. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you for joining us. And there are some groups in process of joining the Repair Network, and we still welcome you here, even if you haven't officially completed membership. This is a chance to learn from Indigenous partners, to come together, to strategize, to grow, to get to know each other, to share each other's challenges. I know Waterford Mennonite will be voting in 2 weeks about whether or not to join, and they've been with us from the beginning. So grateful for communities that have walked this path for a while and those just joining. If you are just joining, be considering what local struggles are there that you might lift up to our attention and awareness? We heard about Oak Flat, for example, through Pastor Carol Rose in Tucson. We've heard about other struggles like Dakota land recovery from people in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, working with Makoche Kichupe. So there could be other grassroots on the ground struggles, as well as national campaigns like ICWA that we can work at together. So we have both a national, international, and local approach to organizing. I actually just want to take a moment to give the floor again to Sarah, because you all may have heard about a month ago, there was this renunciation statement that came out from the Vatican, from Pope Francis, that renounced the doctrine of discovery. So this was a huge symbolic step. This was a big opening that was the result of decades that I'm aware of work of Indigenous organizers to just even get an acknowledgement and what they hoped for, a repudiation. And so I wanted to invite you, Sarah, to maybe share your reflections. You've been in this movement yourself for many years. What is your sense of the effectiveness of this statement? What are next steps? What are your responses?
Sure. So the really powerful thing about the statement is the ability for the dominant culture to continue to hear about the doctrine of discovery and what it is. Although the doctrine of discovery is deeply ingrained in our legal structure in the United States, that is to say, it is threaded through every institution in the United States, most Americans don't know anything about it. And so for the Catholic Church to make the statement is a great way for us to continue to be able to talk about it. I do have a newspaper clipping in my own little hometown here in Central Washington about the statement. And so that's one thing that I think is really positive. I want to be really clear, though, in saying that while the Catholic Church has made an acknowledgement of some culpability in terms of the doctrine of discovery, that does not change the legal structure itself. Because the doctrine of discovery was adopted into the United States legal canon in 1823 in a series of Supreme Court decisions, the Marshall decisions, it is very much embedded in our legal structure. And so while the Catholic Church was an originator of the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of discovery is now embedded in the legal system in the United States and in many countries around the world that were formed by colonization. Of course, the United States was formed by colonization, and so was Canada, so was Mexico, so were the countries of Central and South America, so were countries across Asia and in Africa. And in those countries that were formed by colonization, the doctrine of discovery is still embedded in the law. So this statement does not make that go away. So another thing that I think is important to note about the statement itself is that the Joint Commission, the Vatican says that that this was not really a part of Catholic doctrine, that actually these documents were misinterpreted and manipulated by state authorities, that is to say, national governments, for political ends. And that's also challenging as an Indigenous person to hear, because having read these papal bulls and studied them very carefully that are being referred to, they're actually quite clear in claiming the authority of God, in granting entire nations to European sovereigns or kings and queens. And so that's a little bit hard to take. But aside from that, one thing that I think is really important is this statement gives Catholic activists and other Christian activists the opportunity to petition the Catholic Church for land back. The Catholic Church is the single largest private landowner on earth. I'm going to say that again. The Catholic Church is the single largest private landowner on earth. They own more land than any other private entity on earth. And so this is an opportunity for repairs. As you know, when we talk about repair, we say, you know, first we have to tell the truth and acknowledge wrongdoing. And then the next step that we do is to seek repair. How do we repair the damage that was created? And so we tend to think that apology is the last step. That's the thing that comes last. Before an apology, we need repair. And so one step towards repair is to enter into conversation with Indigenous peoples, not just here in North America, but across the world, in returning land to Indigenous peoples. So really returning land. And I want to say one more thing about land return, and that is that land is the economic engine for generating and accumulating wealth. Land is the economic engine for generating and accumulating wealth. And the Catholic Church has used that engine over centuries to amass huge amounts of wealth. And it is now time, in this time of repair, to provide that engine, the land, to Indigenous peoples who do not even primarily see land as a commodity, but rather as a relative and to be in relationship with it. And so this is a great opportunity for us to petition the Catholic Church to return land to Indigenous peoples. So that's my summary response to the statement from the Vatican.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And if you'd like to read more of Sarah's response and other Indigenous leaders, I'm just putting a religious news service article in the chat, appropriately titled "Indigenous Activists Share Mixed Feelings on Vatican's Repudiation." So thank you, Sarah, for that. I love the response of, this is an opening for organizing around land return, you know, like how do we continue that moving forward? And we are in partnership with this amazing organization called Nuns and Nuns, NUNS and NONES, and we're collaborating with them and other groups on a faith and land back working group or roundtable. And so that's one of the things that they're organizing around is land return and land back in the Catholic Church with religious sisters specifically. So exciting times to be alive, aren't they? I'm going to transition just to a short update. I'm sure many of you are curious what's going on with Apache Stronghold. Where are things at with this movement to protect Oak Flat? Many of you were part of vigils and actions going on across the country. And there were even some actions I saw in Scotland, I think because Sarah had done some speaking by Zoom in Scotland. And so I just want to take a moment to celebrate and to say thank you to everyone who organized so quickly and so effectively in your communities. So I'm seeing Carol raising her hands in applause. We saw so many pictures just come flooding in, and I want to give credit to Michaela Esau, whose inbox was flooded with images and prayers and vigils happening across the country in support of Oak Flat last month, as the Apache Stronghold religious freedom case went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Pasadena. So you can check out that map that one of our volunteers, Hallie, our steering committee co-chair, made of all the prayer actions happening across the land. Many of your communities included on that map. And if not, let us know and send us pictures and we will include them on that map. Wensler Nosey, I heard, saw this map, and I was able to share with him while they're in person in Pasadena about all the prayer happening in response to their invitation to pray with them. And he just put his hand on his heart and just said, you know, that is what we were asking for, and felt deeply moved in spirit to be surrounded by prayer during that whole time that they were at the court. And we continue to pray and ask for your prayers each week because this isn't over yet. The court hasn't decided, and there are some high-level conversations happening right now about the future of Oak Flat. So I'm just going to invite Carol. Carol, if you'll just take a couple minutes, and you know, Sarah, you can chime in as well about any updates about the Oak Flat and where things are at from what you're aware of in this interim waiting period.
Maybe we could start that off by centering in prayer. Take a deep breath if you wish. And I invite you to imagine your way into the blessing the heart of a judge who is thinking about what to write. Because chances are good they haven't written yet, that they're still talking. Health, especially for one judge who has big health challenges and is a wonderful ally. Conviction for judges that want to that are tempted by the side of the industry, extractive industry in this matter. May they write justice. May they write something that opens a window of possibility for rethinking spiritual relationship with the land. Our relationship with God and the land does not stop with what humans do on the surface. It is sacred all the way down. Amen. So you already talked about that great gathering of prayer, and we were there on the convoy, we were there in person, we were there all over the place. And that makes a difference to the people that we are gathered with, the Apache Stronghold. And they're doing storytelling and spreading the word on Facebook, on all the media and all the articles. And that makes a difference as well, as we've just heard with ICWA. The last time the Ninth Circuit Court, only 3 judges heard Apache Stronghold's case. They took 6 months to come back with a decision. We don't know how long they'll take this time. So we're in waiting, and we assume that they're in a writing and discernment time period. Well, and we also organized for one of the amicus briefs that was presented. So if they find against Oak Flat, then Apache Stronghold will take that to the Supreme Court, who actually have so far found in favor of every religious freedom case they've heard. So it's a little bit of a different situation from many of the other kinds of cases that we support in the Supreme Court context. The administrative branch of the US government was doing something, and we don't know what they were doing. And Sarah and others organized a wonderful response to Apache Stronghold's request for emails to go to the federal government, lest they release the final environmental impact study and start the countdown for the transfer of land. There are a number of other things they might have been doing. We don't know. But that seems to be on a pause, and perhaps our prayer and emails helped that pause. Wenzler is under death threats at this time. He's been shot at 3 times in the last years. And a sister organization to this one, Community Peacemaker Team, CPT, is at this time working to establish some accompaniment, some trained accompaniment to take weight off of Wenzler's family, in that providing security of at least having someone with him. And several of us have both hats, have CPT hats and dismantling the doctrine of discovery hats. And Sarah, I don't know if you want to talk about legislation yet, but it's always on our radar to get the Save Oak Flat Act moved forward to the next step, which in this case would be out of committee onto the floor, or getting all of our representatives to sign on to it as co-sponsors. Because Congress is the one who set up the legal structure that would steal the land and give it to the foreign mining interest. And it's really Congress who needs to revoke that. Or the immediate threat will continue, even if the court were to decide in the favor, the Congress, it would be much better if the Congress also revoked it. Anything else that I'm missing?
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Sarah, I just welcome you if you'd like to share just where you're feeling called or where we might invite folks to participate in that legislative action in the future.
Sure enough. So just a note about our structure. In our coalition, our campaign work is led by working groups. So we do have a working group that is called the Oak Flat Solidarity Working Group, and Carol Rose is our chair. And so with the leadership of the working group, we have a legislative campaign afoot, and very much looking forward to joining with the working group in that. And so from my point of view, having not talked that over with leadership yet, but I'm still very much looking forward to doing that in the next few days. I am going to say we have two targets in our legislative campaign. So once again, as Carol said, this legislative campaign is targeted at revoking the Oak Flat. Well, it's the Save Oak Flat Act is what it's called. So our targets, from my point of view, are two. One is to really focus on senators in Arizona to and representatives, but I think senators, especially, anyway, senators in Arizona, so really to put pressure there. And the second is to target the Senate, and particularly the working group for natural resources. And so we have a spreadsheet of who is on that committee, and we're going to be reaching out to congregations across the United States and put together delegations to lobby those senators, because we really want to get this out of committee. So we have quite a lot of support in the House. We have very paltry support in the Senate. We do have Bernie Sanders, which is terrific because he happens to sit on the correct committee, but he has to be joined by others. We're very much looking for bipartisan support across a wide geographical area. So if you're interested in joining this campaign, look forward to hearing from us. If you're not interested in joining the campaign, you will probably still be hearing from us as we start. I'm just kidding about that, but as we start organizing our national legislative campaign. This is not our first legislative campaign. We have had successful national legislative campaigns before. And so I'm really looking forward to digging in on this. And I want to say this too, as we go towards this campaign, which is so exciting, our goal is not legislative success alone. It is transformation. Our goal is transformation. Our goal is transformation. Every relationship we build in the Senate is a movement towards change. Every relationship we build in Arizona, in the state of Arizona, is a relationship towards change. Every relationship in the House, that's what we're working for. We're not just working for outcomes. We're working for transformation in our world. And we believe that we can partner with the Stronghold Apache and the San Carlos Apache people in pursuit of that transformation that they long for and that they are leading us in. And we join that work in this way. So I look forward to giving you all updates as we unfurl that legislative campaign.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and for that note of transformation too. And I'm always reminded and always remind people of the call that we had when Vanessa Nosey, Wensler's daughter, shared with us. I believe it was Vanessa who said, you know, we are fighting for all of you. And it was just this reminder of, we're not just joining this Oak Flat campaign because we want to help our Indigenous neighbors. That may be part of it, but ultimately, this is about land. This is about transformation of the structures that govern our society. This is about life for all of us and for future generations. So I think it's an important reminder to keep beating on. I probably sound like a clanging gong around it, but it's important for me to remind myself, as someone who's white, especially, that it doesn't go into that easy slide into white savior complex, because that's not what this is about. This is about mutual liberation and solidarity together. I also just want to invite you all. We have an upcoming prayer and action hour every month. We meet the last Friday of the month. And for the last month and this month, we're focusing on how to write letters to the editor and supporting one another to do so. So we'll be writing letters to the editor as a prayer action and praying together over Zoom in support of Oak Flat. So that'll be from 1 to 2 Pacific time or from 4 to 5 Eastern time. And there's the link to register. It's open to anyone. So this is for the public, not just the Repair Network. I just want to take a moment because we've been talking a lot, you know, sharing updates with you as staff, as committee chairs, just to hear, are there any questions in the room so far? Any responses? How is this touching home for you? Questions for clarification, responses, affirmations, confusions? Would love to hear. I see, and feel free to raise your hand, like Ralph is doing, if you know how to do that, or literally raise your hand, physical hand, and I will look through the chat. Ralph, go ahead and unmute and share any questions or responses.
Yeah, I have a couple questions that are purely for clarification. I've been following Oak Flat for years, since before John McCain died, and I'm curious over it. I read something, I believe last week, in something from the coalition that implied that the Oak Flat area was reservation land. It's always been my impression it is not reservation land. Am I right?
It is land that Apache lived on before they were removed and made prisoners of war on what is now the San Carlos Reservation. So it's Apache land. It is claimed by the National Forest System.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Ralph.
One other question, again, just for my understanding, is the land being given to the Korean company, mining company, or sold to them by the government?
The US government has promised to trade land, to trade Oak Flat for some other portions of land owned by the Australian company Rio Tinto, or actually its subsidiary, Resolution Copper. So it's a land trade swap.
Okay, okay, thank you.
That they've promised and will not be able to carry out.
Thank you, Ralph, for the questions. And we can send out some more information, or Michaela, I might invite you to share your recommended resources in the chat. Michaela is our Indigenous Solidarity Coordinator based in Tucson and has been doing a lot of reading and writing around these issues and coordinating folks there. Other questions or comments? I'll just maybe take another minute or so to hear from you all. We're a small enough group that I invite you, if you would like, to just come off mic and share a question, comment related to Oak Flat, related to these updates that you've been hearing from Carol, from Sarah. I'm scanning, I'm not seeing other hands. And Martin, please feel free to, share your question or comment.
Hi, yeah, I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina. We don't have a large Indigenous population here anymore, but something I've been thinking about that Shoney mentioned and Paul mentioned is trauma, like intergenerational trauma. And I think one of the things that I've discovered in myself and in my community is such a denial of what happens and what has happened that it's almost impossible to speak to someone because they've put up such a barricade against talking about the truth. And I'm curious, how do you get through to people who are not even able to hear the truth that you're telling them?
That's such a good question. I'm looking to Sarah Augustine. You've got a lot of experience with this. Feel free, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to have more conversation about this because I think it's something that many of us wonder about. And one of the things that I will say right off the bat is that we are, as a coalition, speaking to people who wish to join us. We don't spend a lot of energy trying to convince naysayers. We're reaching out to people who are willing to engage in this pathway of transformation and willing to join us in that. And understanding that as we work at changing structures and changing culture, that others will come along with us. So those people whose hearts are hardened today may be softened up tomorrow because of the very work that we're willing to do together. And so that's one thing. Another thing that is a little more complicated that I'll say that, and forgive me for being tedious here for a minute, is to, one thing that's been really helpful for me is just to really listen carefully, because often when there is difficult language to hear, there's almost always a request embedded in it somewhere. So I'll often just spend some time trying to listen and reflect back what I hear, because I'm really looking for the interest. Like, what is your interest underneath that? And often it's fear, like a fear of what I'm going to lose. If Native people gain something, what do I have to lose? That's often what it is. And so rather than trying to talk somebody out of that, I usually try to affirm, wow, those sounds like those feelings are really, really big, you know? And yeah, it sounds like you're really anxious about what you have to lose. And just affirm that you're not crazy. Those are valid interests. Those feelings are real. And then sometimes when a person feels affirmed, they're willing to have more conversations. So that's what I try and do. Am I always successful with that? No, my colleagues will tell you, oh my gosh, Sarah blows her top. Yes, it does happen. But that's in my best self. That's what I'm trying to inhabit, is to do some compassionate listening.
And that's a really great question for ongoing learning. I don't have like an easy answer to that either. But I will say we're going to be having a time for some more in-person dialogue and deep conversations during our annual gathering in Kansas City. We'll be gathering in Hutchinson, Kansas, following the Kansas City Mennonite Church USA convention in Kansas City. And we're meeting getting in the evening of July 7th. Which is a Friday, and then starting our annual meeting on Saturday and Sunday. Michaela, actually, this is her family's congregation. Michaela is our Mennonite Voluntary Service intern and communications coordinator and Indigenous Solidarity coordinator. She has a very long title for a half-time job. And Michaela, you're welcome to share, to share in the chat or to share more, details about this training and annual meeting time together. But for all of you who are interested in just leaning in, like, how do we engage people both in our communities or congregations, as well as outside our congregations in our wider communities in this work? I hope that this training will also give a chance. We were going to talk a little bit more about this tonight, but just given the time, I just wanted to say that that Sarah and I have been developing a day-long training on Monday, July 10th, that we're calling Moving Toward Right Relations. And this training, we're hoping to really draw from some examples as a coalition about ways that we've showed up in helpful ways, but also some not so helpful ways and even harmful ways as we seek to build bridges and relationships with Indigenous communities taking into account intergenerational trauma that's there on both ends for those in dominant culture society, for those who are Christians and or white settlers, for those who are Indigenous. You know, there is deep and sensitive work to do together. And this is going to require skill building on our part. It's going to require hard conversations. And ultimately what we want is for people not to go into those trauma response modes, which are, you know, fight or flight or freeze or fawn, when confronted with difficulty or with shame, as the singer today, Paul, brought up earlier in our song about moving through shame and learning from our mistakes. We want to really develop a training that helps us engage in the work of entering into right relations, knowing that's going to be lifelong or even intergenerational work with Indigenous or other communities where there's a power imbalance. And to really, you know, grow our capacity as a repair network to create strength among ourselves so that we can be accountable to one another to do that work in a good way. And this training, like I mentioned, emerges out of real life experiences, some of them recent, some of them from the past, where we haven't always showed up in a good way. And we want to talk about those mistakes honestly and vulnerably with each other. And talk about the ways that we're swimming in this soup of white supremacy and Christian domination, and that's kind of the norm. That's an assumption or a given in any interaction. And so how do we be conscious of that? How do we find support so that we can move forward and really seek repair, both internally and externally, to stay at the table, and that way, you know, we're not running away or hiding when confronted with challenge. So I just want to invite you to join us for that training and to continue these good conversations together. This is our last quarterly meeting before that training, and so that will really take the place of that summer quarterly meeting together. If you can't come, will you pass on this link? And I'll share this with you all. It was shared in a newsletter. I'll share it again. It's not just in person, but we'll have Zoom options as well. It'll be a little tricky to coordinate on Zoom what was designed for an in-person training, but we're going to do our best to make it hybrid for those who can't join in person. And we're just asking for $30 for the materials, because this is one of the gifts that we want to offer you as Repair Network members in this reciprocal relationship of showing up with Indigenous peoples and community and also resourcing you all as communities and congregations. So you're welcome to join for the whole annual gathering, for the whole weekend as participants and as those who are part of our larger coalition through the Repair Network, or just come to the Repair Network training that Monday, July 10th. So I'm looking especially to Michaela or to Sarah, anything that you'd want to add to that invitation to the annual meeting?
Yeah, I was on the annual meeting via Zoom last year, and it was still a great experience. So if you can't come in person, don't let that scare you. But if you can come in person, I can vouch that Hutchinson is maybe not the most exciting tourist place, but a welcoming community and should be a great place for us to recenter ourselves before the coming year and celebrate together and learn together.
We're so excited to come to Hutchinson, but you know, friends, please come. We want you. Please consider coming to our annual gathering. This is really the one time a year that we're all together, and it's a chance for us to share and build friendship, get to know each other, and build coalition. This is our time to really sustain ourselves in relationship as we go out into the world and do the work that we've set ourselves to do. One slogan that we repeat again and again, or I do anyway, is that we come out of conviction. We come to this work out of conviction, and we stay out of love. We come out of conviction, but we stay out of love. Love for each other, love for the community that we build together, love for the relationships that we build with Indigenous peoples. And so please do consider coming and being with us. It would be so good to see you there.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Michaela. And if you need homestay coordination, let us know in that form. Michaela's pastor and our administrator are coordinating homestays. If you need travel scholarships, let us know. We want to make this as accessible as possible. And Michaela just put in the chat an article that she wrote in college that features Hutchinson, a beautiful town.
I said I can't be told that I'm underselling Hutchinson. I've promised I have home.
I think you just froze, Michaela, but yes, Hutchinson is an amazing place, and let's all gather there and build relationships and friendships together. I would love to see you all there. Some of you I've met in person, others I haven't met yet, but I'm really excited for that. Just valuable each year to come together and build community together. So thank you, everyone. You're welcome to hang out on Zoom a little bit longer. Would love to just kind of go off mic and chat with anyone who'd like to share or introduce yourselves. But our meeting has come to a close on this hour, and I just want to share so much gratitude. Feel free to put a word of gratitude that you have for our time tonight in the chat. And just want to say thank you. This work means so much to me. That we get to come together in community to seek to be an alternative and a part of the alternative kingdom of God, of Creator, forming new relationships together for the sake of love and for the sake of justice. So thank you all. Great to see you. Carol, thank you for sharing about Oak Flat and for just your ongoing witness there.